In this video, we're going to see how to extend a SilkUI pattern. Imagine you have a customer that wants to change the standard 3-column SilkUI widget called column 3, as you can see here in these 3 examples in the browser. So he wants the rightmost 2 columns to take up half the screen room, and the other column here, the first one, to take up the other half. So these will be smaller than this one here. Now, we in SilkUI don't exactly have this pattern, but it's very easy to adapt our 3-column pattern to one of these. Let's see how we can do this. Now we have here this exact same application, and the first widget that you're going to see here, let us open the widget tree, is of course the standard 3 columns SilkUI pattern. Below it, you have one way of solving this problem, of making these 2 columns smaller. Another way of doing the same thing, and a third way of doing the same thing. So all in all, 3 different ways of doing the same thing. And then at the bottom we have simply 3 examples for the reverse case of the other columns being smaller. Let's look at each of these in turn. Let's take a look at the first example. The first example shows a customized SilkUI widget. Let's double click to open it. And here we can see it's a web block that we created, as you can see here, a web block that we created in the common folder. This web block is simply built by having our standard columns 3 SilkUI widget inside a container, which happens to have a specific style class, cols3leftbig. And we simply replicate all the behaviors and requirements of this SilkUI in our own web block. So we need to have 3 placeholders, we need to have all these input parameters that the standard Silk web block has, and replicate them, like I said, in our own web block. As you can see here, input parameters and placeholders. And now, of course, our CSS solves the actual problem. It's here at the bottom, and these lines do all the work. They say that when one of our SilkUI widgets called columns3, which has this class, is inside anything that has this class here, which happens to be our container, cols3leftbig, then the first column has the width of 50% and all the remaining columns have the width of 25%. And we also add another rule for the reverse case. So when it's right big, then the last column is 50% and all the others after right big are 25%. This is the actual CSS that makes everything work. And again, this CSS simply says that the standard SilkUI widget needs to be enclosed in any HTML element that has this specific class. Let's go back to our other column examples. The second example that yields the same result is a web block. This web block is a standard web block that will wrap anything with a cols3leftbig, hence its name. So let us open the web block, and in the widget tree you see that we only have actually a placeholder. Clicking on the placeholder reveals that it has our cols3leftbig class that we need to make the adjustments to the standard SilkUI widget. Since this web block does not include by itself the SilkUI widget, we need to place it inside the weblog when we're using the weblog. So back to our screen, we can see that inside the weblog, we have the standard columns 3 widget. Of course, this isn't as easy to use as the first solution, because now we need to remember to actually use the proper widgets inside our weblog. It's generic, but harder to use for your developers, and therefore more error-prone. Finally, we have yet another way to solve this, and we're solving it by directly having our container with the class that we need, the cols3left big, and inside of it we have our standard silky-white columns 3. This has a desired effect, but again, there's no standardization. Now, not only do we need to know which widget to add inside our container, we also need to know that we need to add a specific class to that specific container. It's even harder and more error-prone than the previous solution. So out of the three, our recommendation is always to use the first solution. Define your own widgets by wrapping all the necessary widgets and classes around the standard silky-white widgets. There is one additional way to solve this that is not shown here, because it's not the recommended method. You could have come here to the CSS and instead of creating rules that only change columns 3 if it's within a specific classed element, it always changes columns 3. Now the problem with that is that now you can't create exceptions. Once you do this, you get all these kinds of weird behaviors. We're now very weird because the leftmost and the rightmost columns are meant to be big. Let's fix this by ignoring the rightmost column being big. So I'm going to delete this rule and this rule here. By doing this now, they're all the same size, including the standard, because we actually changed the standard silky-white widget. The problem now is that semantically, another fellow developer is not expecting the standard silky-white widget to behave differently. Once he realizes this, he needs to override our changes in CSS to get the original sizes back. The original widget, therefore, has now become a source of confusion and reduced developer productivity.